The 6th of June, 1944, D-Day. 80 years on, it's still the largest amphibious invasion of all time, when over 150,000 Allied troops landed in Normandy on France's northern coast, with one goal: to overwhelm the Germans and begin to ultimately liberate Europe. It's a date that evokes emotion and national pride in equal measure, and it not only changed the Second World War, but history itself. Yet what if the operation hadn't been a success? Welcome to History Undone. I'm James Hanson. This is the show where we take an alternative look at the events which have shaped our world. Each episode will focus on a different battle from throughout history, but using modern military analysis. We'll ask how things could have played out differently with a few tactical changes. All you have to do is watch, share and subscribe to History Undone on YouTube. Today, it's the assault on Omaha Beach, the most heavily defended of all 5 D-Day beaches, meaning it was also, tragically, home to the highest number of casualties. Joining me to discuss this are the historian and researcher at the Tank Museum, Chris Copson, and former Amphibious Commander, Rear Admiral Dr Chris Parry. Welcome to you both. Now, before we go into the specifics, let's just rewind the clock and remind ourselves of what happened in the months leading up to the invasion of D-Day. Chris Copson, give us a sense of what was going on in the war at that time. Who was on the front foot? What was the state of play?
OK, so what we've got here, the map title is The Atlantic Wall. And this is the situation in 1942, 43, 44. The Wehrmacht has given up any idea of crossing the Channel to invade England. They've gone the other way, they've gone to Russia. But they realise, especially with America in the war from December 1941, that it's going to go the other way round, that at some point we will be crossing the Channel to liberate occupied Europe. And this is what you'd call, this is the hard crust of Nazi-occupied Europe. It's a series of defences that extend all the way from Norway right the way round to the Spanish border. And the other name for it is Festung Europa, Fortress Europe. And these are put in place. They had near as damn it 3 years to actually get all this done. And they've done a very thorough job. There are areas which are unlikely to see an invasion. I mean, Norway, most likely. Although, as Dr. Chris has reminded me a moment or two ago, there's 220,000 German troops there who have a very peaceful war and surrender at the end. But the area where it's likely to kick off is down on the Channel, the narrow seas, the area where it's easiest to cross. So that's where the bulk of the defences, the toughest area, the toughest nut to crack, is there. And it's the area around from the Zuiderzee, down the Channel coast, down to Brittany.
OK, so that's the wider context of where the war was in June 1944. We're going to zoom in now. This is a map of the 5 Normandy beaches: Sword, Juno, Gold, Omaha and Utah. This is the Cotentin Peninsula. Dr. Chris Parry, I want to bring you in on this because obviously with your experience as an amphibious commander, you're the perfect person to speak to. What made Normandy the obvious place for the Allies to choose? Because Hitler was expecting Calais.
Well, of course, what we wanted to do is convince the Germans that Calais was the option that we favoured. And of course, there was a whole load of dummy formations and sort of communications deception going on at that end. The reason that Normandy was picked is it's opposite the point where you're concentrating in the UK. Quite a lot of the troops, the aircraft and the ships were in Portsmouth, Plymouth, and along the south coast ports and harbours. But most importantly, you've got a very broad approach to the beaches here. You can actually get on to the coastline on a very, very broad front. And we've got to remember that in order to overwhelm these defences and also the mobile concentrations of German troops that are behind these defences, you've got to build up combat power really quickly. And the aim was to put 150,000 troops, plus their vehicles, plus their support, ashore on day one. And to do that, you've got to have 5 beaches. Originally, it was going to be 3. Then they expanded it to 5. And as you can see, the Americans are to the west. The British and Canadians are to the east. And that actually reflects where they came from. So quite a lot of the American ships and troops came from the western ports, Plymouth and that way, whereas the British and Canadians came across from Portsmouth. Now, you've got a few problems here. One is you have the weather, and there's quite a heavy swell that comes in from the west in the few days preceding. There's also a huge tidal range. So the difference between low tide and high tide is about 28 feet. And so
Wow.
It comes in very quickly indeed. So once you're ashore, the beach that you've come ashore on is rapidly diminishing. So you need to get off, not only to engage with the Germans, but also because your beach is retreating behind you. The advantage of going in at low tide is you can see where all the obstructions are. And there are massive fortifications and obstructions in the water, including mines, steel sort of barriers, and also all sorts of other things. The other important thing is that the Germans have sighted their artillery into the beach and the shallow water. So as soon as they get into that kill zone and the Germans can see them, they're going to be using their artillery and mortars.
And of course, the weather played a massive part in the timing of the invasion because Eisenhower pushed it back by a day.
Yes, he did, and the gamble paid off. I mean, bizarrely, had he gone on the previous day, it was actually clear skies for the airborne assault, and actually it was quite calm. But then there was a real front came through, a lot of rain, a lot of wind, and a lot of sea, and that swell persisted right up until the morning of D-Day, 5 and 6 o'clock, and quite a lot of the amphibious landing craft were pushed further to the east than they really wanted to be by the swell that was coming down off the peninsula. Utah Beach didn't feel it to the west, but Omaha in particular felt the effects of the swell, not only out at sea, but close inshore as well.
So that's the situation across the 5 beaches. Now, let's zoom in to Omaha Beach in particular. OK, now this is where it gets really interesting. We can zoom in again now, look at Omaha Beach in detail. This is what is shown on this map. And you can see we've got the highly scientific coloured blocks representing the German divisions and the Allies, in this case, the Americans. Dr Chris Parry, to start with you, just talk us through what really happened on that day, and feel free to move the divisions around to represent what happened.
So the action starts about 5 o'clock in the morning when the gunfire from the offshore warships starts to soften up the German defences. And right at the heart of this, you've got the 2 battleships, the USS Texas and the USS Arkansas, and with about 60 other warships as well, starting to pummel the German defences. Not only the concrete structures and communications networks ashore, but trying to also target the artillery, mortar platforms and other areas of firepower. The other thing that is happening is that troops are starting to get into their landing craft. They're about 6,000 yards offshore. There is a heavy swell. They are getting swamped and having to bail out on the way in. And each landing craft carries about 36 troops. The Rangers out to the west, they have 22 troops in their landing craft because they've got more equipment. But you've got a mass of landing craft coming off the transport ships and landing craft. You've got rockets flying through the air trying to take out the German defences. Just beforehand, you've had 352 B-24 bombers try again to destroy the defences. But because they're not night trained, instead of flying down the coast where you maximise your chances of actually hitting the target, they fly across the coast. So they're not very accurate. The other big problem that we've got is that the latest intelligence hasn't been updated. So the German positions are actually stronger than everybody thinks they are. And they're actually stronger than the beaches elsewhere. So you've got to get as many people ashore as you can. You've got to get them inshore as soon as you can to push back the German defences, establish a bridgehead and rapidly build up combat power because you don't know what's coming in from the Germans behind as well.
And Chris Copson, what made Omaha as a beach so difficult geographically? I mean, a lot of people will remember, for example, the first 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan, yeah. Omaha, and it's known as Bloody Omaha. What made it so challenging?
Partly it is the topography, because you've got a broad sandy beach. There's actually a shingle bar just offshore from that, which actually makes getting landing craft right in quite difficult. Then behind the beach, there's high ground. From the east through the west, it's rising. up at this end, they are really quite substantial cliffs, because of course you've got Pointe Du Hoc just around the corner, which is taken by the Rangers.
Yeah, so this is Pointe Du Hoc here represented, just on this corner here.
Right. But even further down, there are still high bluffs behind the beach. There are 5 draws, which are shallow valleys that actually come down to the beach. That is your way off the beach. But of course, those are really heavily defended. They are obvious weak points. In terms of the German defences, we have inland, there are coastal gun batteries, there are artillery batteries dug in, and then coming down to the beach itself, there are 15 what we call Widerstandsnester, which are hardened strong points. Lots of automatic weapons, mounting redundant tank turrets for fire support, very difficult nuts to crack. And then, actually right down on the beach itself, there are beach-level bunkers. And the peculiar thing about these is they're not facing out to sea. They're actually facing down the line of the beach, enfilading fire. At Vierville, there's a particularly good example. In fact, it's built into the base of the American monument there. And it's a solid block of concrete with a PAC-43, an 88mm anti-tank gun sat in there. That's a fearsome weapon. If that's firing down the beach as you're trying to get across it, that's going to give you major, major problems.
I think it's worth bearing in mind, Chris, that the German machine gun at that time is firing 1,400 rounds a minute. You actually melted the barrel if you actually fired it more than 250.
The MG42.
Yeah, and so this is a real sort of firepower deterrent. You don't want to go anywhere near it. And yet every one of these sort of resistance nests, as Chris mentions, has got up to 3 to 5 of these, and they're covering the whole area. And we've got to remember these machine gun posts and also the artillery are already sighted. They know exactly where they're going to fire along this beach. And as Chris mentioned, you've got this enfilade fire. And one of the things that's remarkable about Omaha Beach is that more than half the casualties were caused by artillery, not by infantry or machine gun fire. We totally underestimated, in terms of intelligence, what the Germans actually had there. But what I think is significant, there's only 350 Germans here manning this. There's a lot more behind. But actually, in the front line here, each one of these sort of resistance posts, as they call them, is about 30 to 50 men. So in all, about 350.
But they are in, obviously, concrete,
yep,
in fortified positions.
Yeah.
It's incredibly, I mean, the barrage that we talked about, the naval bombardment, the aerial bombardment, has really very little effect. It's terribly difficult to knock out a concrete fortification by chucking shells at it. But, the whole thing... all of these guys, they are in place. For the infantry, their arcs have been designated. The artillery fire plans are in there. They're very complex, and they can drop shells pretty well exactly where they want.
And in fact, Chris, that day they were planning to have a firepower practice as well along this beach.
Yes.
So they were all ready to do it. So all the ammunition was provided and they knew exactly where their targets were going to be. And so, unfortunately, having delayed by a day actually made them sort of ready for it.
And Dr Chris Parry, just talk me through, because you'll see on this map it's divided into different sectors. So we've got Fox, Easy, Dog, Charlie. Talk me through those and where the Americans focused most of their men on.
As we discussed, what we've got is you need to get onto the beach on a broad front for 2 reasons. One is to take on the Germans, but secondly, to stop stuff piling up. Because you've got the first assault wave, then you've got a second and a third, then you've got all your combat support and combat service support coming in behind it. And it's actually running to a timetable. There is no... one of the big problems on Omaha Beach is it's very rigid. There's very little margin for flexibility. We see people using their initiative, but once you start this, it comes remorselessly on and you're piling stuff and people up on the beach. So you need to get clear. And again, the artillery from the German side plays a part. But what the Americans know is, something that Chris mentioned earlier, is there's concentrations of firepower at both ends of this beach, the western end and the eastern end. And the first company that hits the beach is in this sector, Dog sector, which is divided into red, white and green. They're in green sector. And they absolutely get hit by a very powerful concentration of fire.
Feel free to move them onto the beach if you want to,
from Yeah, well, they get onto the beach, but of course it then becomes carnage. And the first company, A company, is totally destroyed on arrival. Then B and C companies arrive, they join. But what is happening all along this beach is you're seeing landings, and the Germans are having to divide their fire, obviously, to take it on. But with the artillery, as we mentioned, you just got to hit the beach. But let's get some perspective. This is 11 miles long. People think it's a small beach. If you go there, it's actually a very long beach. So you've got to have that breadth to be able to get on. And remember, the tide is coming in. Now, one of the biggest problems that we thought that we faced in 1944 was the fact that these beach obstructions would be here. But in fact, because we assaulted at low tide, the warships have been able to take out quite a lot of these obstructions. But they're still left quite a few. And of course, it caused casualties. But the Americans managed to get onto the beach. They've got to make it here to this sea wall because that provides them with some cover. They've also got some tanks. And I'm going to hand over to Chris because he's the tank man.
You are the tank man, Chris. Go on, tell us about the tanks.
Now, we mentioned Saving Private Ryan earlier, and you have got that horrific 20-minute reconstruction. I mean, that's an opposed beach landing, if you like. It is the most difficult and dangerous thing you can possibly undertake. Because the other guy's going to be sat there in his bunker looking at you through a weapon sight. Lots of you are going to get killed. Getting armour, getting tanks onto the beach at an early stage, absolutely invaluable. So we have these peculiar, what they call DD tanks, DD Shermans. DD is duplex drive, and what it is, it's 25 tons of Sherman tank with a flotation screen around it, braced on the inside of the scaffolding, and propellers at the back, that's the duplex drive bit. So suddenly you've got 25 tons of Sherman that floats and swims. And there are two battalions of DD tanks, the 741st, 743rd Battalion, being sent in this area here to provide fire support. But this is where it starts to go wrong. I mean, the swell here is about 8 feet high. Yeah. These things are designed to take a swell of up to about 18 inches. So the 741st launched their 32 Shermans off their landing ship's tank. They're about 6,000 yards out. They're only supposed to be launched at about a third of that. They get hit by the swell, they turn, broach and sink. 28 out of 32 sink offshore. Fortunately, a lot of the crews are saved. The 743rd have a better idea. They see what's happening to their fellow tank battalion, and the LSTs actually bring them pretty well right into the beach. So they actually get their tanks ashore. But they then start to draw fire. And there was a quote from an American soldier. He said, the tanks came ashore, they shot the hell out of everything, and everything shot the hell out of them. So by the end of the day, there are only 5 viable Shermans actually on that beach, able to provide fire support, crunch through the barbed wire, and suppress the pillboxes, machine gun posts. And
on the topic of the Sherman DDs, it's worth saying you've actually got one at the Tank Museum, which you're very proud of.
We do. We have the last intact Sherman DD with its original flotation screen.
Wow. And it's also worth saying you have an amazing YouTube channel. If you're liking this, you're going to absolutely love the Tank Museum's YouTube channel. Make sure you check it out, like, share, subscribe. You've got some great videos that are very relevant to what we're talking about today.
I think it's worth mentioning, Chris, that way back in January, they knew this beach wouldn't be great for tanks. We had a couple of sort of frogmen who went in. They did a recce early. And they did it about 30 runs in from a miniature submarine. And they came back and they said to Bradley, the American commander, you know, this beach isn't great. You're going to take a lot of casualties. And look at this sand.
Yeah.
This is not going to take tanks. Yeah. And he actually said, I know, my boy, I know. But he knew that we had to actually invade on a broad front. The other thing that's worth stressing here, of course, is if you're coming in a landing craft, you're actually channeling your troops as they come ashore. So all the German machine gunner has to do is line up on the front of the landing craft. And it's like running through a corridor or a defile. You're just taking people out as they come out of the landing craft.
That must have been absolutely nightmarish. Because you've got the landing craft coming in, they're hitting that sandbar, and you've got guys, you know, if they're not hit as the ramp goes down, they're piling off the ramp into at least neck-deep water.
Yeah, it's these here, look. You see, Dog Green is where the problem was. Look, you've got these sandbars offshore. You're absolutely right. You're either getting killed as you come out of the landing craft, and that is your Save It Private Ryan situation, or you're getting in the water, and of course you've got a lot of equipment, ammunition and stuff like that. And some people said, well, we can walk ashore, it's low tide, but you've got loads of gullies and things like that. It's a real problem. Omaha is the most difficult beach topographically, both offshore and once you get ashore as well.
But, Chris Copson, I mean, it's worth remembering, despite the challenges of Omaha, it was a success. Just talk me through very briefly where the Americans were able to advance once they were ashore.
Right. So, over in the east, you've got the Big Red One, the 1st US Infantry Division, who are massively more experienced than the 29th, who are over here in the west. What happens is you do have that, I'm going to say it again, the Saving Private Ryan moment. You have an awful lot of guys chopped down on the beach. An awful lot of those are officers and SNCOs, the guys who are actually pushing people forward. So discipline doesn't break down, but unit cohesion does. They make it as far as the seawall. They are then, they're in cover. They're still alive. They're quite happy about that. Getting them to move on further, if you've got a strange officer saying, come on guys, you need to go, that's actually quite difficult, especially with troops. A lot of these have never been in combat before. What does happen is they start moving forward because, and there's a quote that's been used quite a lot, Brigadier General Dutch Norman Cotter, said there's two sorts of guys on this beach, dead ones and ones who are about to get killed. Let's get off the beach. And they start to push forward. And the most successful attempt forward is over at Colville, over in the west. And over in that direction, infantry squads from the Big Red One, from 1st US Infantry Division, actually push forward by about 7:35. So it's an hour since H hour. The German troops in the Widerstand-Nester are starting to report there are guys behind us. They've actually got through the wire, and they're starting to make steady progress inland. By the end of the day, they have advanced roughly 2.5 kilometres off the beach. Something similar is happening over here. These two, the Colville Draw and the Vierville Draw, are they're the best routes off. And guys from 29th Inf are actually moving forward, and they have a tentative sort of gap in the defences here. They've actually moved into the Vierville Draw. Now, the whole thing about this, the plan, what do they say about plans? They survive 2 minutes in contact with the enemy. The plan is that the beachhead will be 8 kilometres deep by the end of D-Day. Instead, you've got 2.5 km over on this side, a few hundred metres on this side. In the middle, really very little progress. And this is, as Dr. Chris mentioned earlier, this is where you get first wave stuck on the beach, second wave coming in, crashing into the back of that. So there's an awful lot of confusion on the beach. And then you get supply vehicles coming in. I mean, there's extraordinary things. There's an RAF radar unit stuck in the middle of this melee.
Because the Americans don't have radar, believe it or not.
But it turns into a colossal traffic jam of vehicles and little determined parties of men. I mean, they've got a job to do and they damn well want to do it.
And of course, in total, 34,000 American troops landed on Omaha Beach. We should mention, Dr. Chris Parry, Pointe Du Hoc and what the Rangers were doing.
Absolutely, because one of the first actions on this day was an assault by the American Rangers of Pointe Du Hoc, which is a cliff anything between 110 and 150 feet high. There was thought to be a large number of German 155mm guns there, which would have had a significant effect on what was going on the beach. They scaled those heights using grappling irons and rocket-assisted ropes. They'd been previously used by the SAS under Paddy Mayne in Sicily. Got to the top, they neutralised what they thought were the guns. They turned out to be telegraph poles, which were being used as dummies, with the real battery 1.5 kilometres behind. Now, they were supposed to have signalled back to their fellow Rangers, a couple of other battalions, that they scaled the heights, and then the other Rangers would have followed them. they failed to get that message back. So those Ranger battalions were then funneled into the campaign at the end of the beach near Vierville and reinforced essentially the assault on one of the draws coming off the beach there quite significantly, to tell you the truth.
OK, so that's what really happened on Omaha Beach on the 6th of June, 1944. Now let's undo all of that. This is History Undone. OK, so in front of us now we have the German positions as they were on that day. But I'm going to put you in a slightly weird position now, Dr Chris Parry. I want you to imagine you are Rommel and you have everything at your disposal that he had on the day, but you've also got complete control of the panzer divisions. You haven't got some down in the south of France. You haven't got to wait for Hitler to wake up for you to be allowed to deploy certain others. So what would you do differently in his shoes?
Well, I wouldn't be at my wife's birthday party. That's the first thing, which is where he was, of course, at the time. And quite a lot of the German commanders were away. They were either in Paris or they were at command meetings somewhere else. So this is quite a dislocated organisation that we've got here. Now, the real problem that Rommel's got, the problem I would have, as soon as I move any of my troops or any of my panzer divisions, they're going to be hit by Allied air power. And it was always thought that if there was massive reinforcement of the German positions here at any stage during this operation, then fighter ground attack aircraft, bombers would be brought in to sort them out. And Rommel had experience of that in North Africa, so he was very nervous of doing that. So if I were Rommel, and Rommel said if I had another 2 weeks, I would have actually made the Atlantic Wall pretty secure against.
And you think he could have done it in 2 weeks?
I'm not sure, but he said he would.
Yeah.
That's the point. But if I'm Rommel right now, I've got my armoured formations concealed. I've got them camouflaged, and I know that I've got to have them a short distance from the beach. So I'm going to have them probably in urban areas. So, you know, in Bayeux, in Caen, maybe even some of them in Cherbourg. I'm having them concealed, though. And if it were me, I'd wait until they were on the beach. I'd wait till the action had started, and I would then commit my armoured formations very quickly indeed.
Chris Copson, what about the Luftwaffe? Because there were all kinds of stories about he'd been promised 1,000 Luftwaffe. How could that have changed things?
I mean, that obviously didn't happen. The bulk of the Luftwaffe at this point are committed to defending Germany from the vast fleets of bombers that are coming over. So the Luftwaffe aren't able to intervene in a suitable sort of fashion to actually make a difference here. But of course, the whole thing about it, the reason that that scenario doesn't happen is a piece of deception, Operation Fortitude. A lot of people know about this, and the fact that the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command, were convinced that it was going to happen on the Pas de Calais and not in Normandy. So, as we briefly mentioned, the Panzer divisions aren't here for the most part. The Das Reich division is 2 weeks away down in the south of France. They're scattered about all over the place, but they're far too far east to actually intervene on the beaches. There is one Panzer division here, 21st Panzer, and they are near Caen, so they're over on effectively the British sector. They are really a shadow of the formation they used to be. 21st Panzer with Rommel in North Africa did great things. But that division went into POW cage when Tunisia fell. It's been reformed, but the unit that it has been given the same name is a shadow of its former self. They do have some reasonable armor. They've got Panzer IVs, certainly they've got some Panthers, but a lot of their vehicles are really quite superannuated French captures. They should have been able to push forward, smash onto Gold Beach and cause some serious trouble. They don't. There's a peculiar thing that happens here. The British Army had been messing around with flying tanks, glider-borne tanks, big transport glider, the Hamilcar, and you could just about put a Tetrarch light tank in it. The problem is the Tetrarch was a piece of junk, if I'm honest. It was a ludicrous little vehicle. But we do actually drop some of these things behind 21st Panzer. 21st Panzer think, oh dear God, they're dropping tanks behind us, so they effectively don't move or don't move soon enough. If they'd realised what the Tetrarch was like, they would just completely ignore them. Because if a Tetrarch came across a Panzer IV, there's only one conclusion.
So, Dr. Chris, let's start deploying the full force of the Panzers. Let's say you're Rommel, you've got access to them. Where are you putting them?
To tell you the truth, a single Panzer division I'm not going to put out unless I've got a defined objective like Gold Beach. They're not going to survive because as soon as you commit a Panzer division to this scenario, the Allied air forces are going to come in with various aircraft, rockets and very, very serious 30mm cannon as well to shoot them up. There's a real problem. What's really interesting, James, is what happens on the ground, because this is the area that is covered by 84 Corps under General Marks. They get slightly confused signals about what's happening, and they do have a Corps reserve that they can commit if they go into this area. They're the nearest. But what distracts them, in the West in particular, is the fact that the 82nd and the 101st Airborne have landed in the Cherbourg Peninsula. And that totally absorbs their interest. And they actually deploy the bulk of their forces to counter that. So they come away from the beaches, leaving it clear behind. Similarly, down in the east, as Chris said, 21 Panzer gets obsessed by these false indications. But what really cripples the Germans is the inability to delegate authority down to commit forces. There's all sorts of arguments about who is working for whom at various stages. They want 21 Panzer basically subordinated to the 84th Corps, for example. That doesn't happen. You've got a chief of staff who's actually with his mistress and is drunk on the night of the 5th and 6th. So there's all sorts of issues associated with command and control. And at the very point where the Germans need to commit something to actually hit the beaches, they're not there. They're either taken to the west or to the east. Beyond that, you can't mobilise some of these other Panzer divisions that are up near the Pas de Calais because what are the Allies doing? They're hitting the railways. They're hitting the roads, anything that moves. And to be fair, even 3 days into this invasion, some Germans in the West thought it was a feint and that the real assault was still going to be in the Pas de Calais.
Well, Hitler was quite pleased when he got told. When he eventually woke up, he thought, well, great, this means they're going to do Calais in a few days' time and I've been proved right.
Well, yeah, but to be fair, early on, quite a few of the German generals and Hitler himself have said it's going to be Normandy. It is going to be Normandy. I would do Normandy, is what Hitler said.
Yeah.
Why won't they do it? And so they're confused. And so between the deception operation and the real operation, they're getting confused signals. They don't have any aerial reconnaissance because any aircraft are getting shot down in this scenario. They're critically short of what's going on. And so what's happening is you've got isolated groups of German formations and units trying to do their best, but not actually contributing to an overall operational effect.
And Chris, are the units in the right position here?
The German units, I mean, essentially they are, but it is coming back to this idea of this defensive crust, the idea that we need to stop on the beaches. Back behind, there's a great deal of confusion happening. So the Allies are able to establish those beachheads and start pouring men and material in. Once we've done that, once the beachheads are established, I mean, to be honest, the result is...
That's the point at which it becomes inevitable what's going to happen.
It is, yes, yeah, very much so, yeah.
And until you get into the blockage fighting, Chris, where the Germans are actually able to bring up quite significant forces, particularly armour, that you're then up against a different type of enemy in a different sort of context. And of course, it's very difficult fighting through the rest of Normandy. I mean, there are a number of delays that mean we don't get into Bayeux and all that sort of thing. And it becomes serious land fighting after that.
Well, we'll come on to what the Allies could have got wrong or what could have gone wrong for the Allies in a moment. I wonder, Dr. Chris Parry, I mean, if the troops that the Germans had at their disposal on that day were more experienced, I mean, a lot of them are pretty low-quality troops, would that have made much difference? No,
not really. I mean, the weight of attack from the sea, 150,000 troops, is pretty significant. 6 divisions worth of people arriving. And we're saying, along this whole beach stretch here, 350 men with support troops as well. I mean, what did Mao Zedong said? If I have 1 million men and you have 1,000, why do I care? And that's what's happened here.
You really don't need a massive experience. You don't need to be a particularly seasoned soldier to sit there in a concrete pillbox with an MG42.
And was the MG42 the right weapon even? Because although it was very deadly, of course, you know, the barrel would get so wide-hot it needs to be changed a lot. Sometimes it starts misfiring.
I mean, I honestly think it's more difficult to manufacture, but the MG34 with a lower rate of fire is probably the better of the two. Apart from anything else, with 1,100 rounds a minute, you're killing every target 10 times, which is wasteful of ammunition.
Yeah.
But it did intimidate Allied troops. Hitler's buzzsaw.
Had that iconic noise as well they talk about. Yeah. OK, let's talk about what could have gone wrong for the Americans on that day. Dr Chris Parry, talk us through some of the things that might have thrown a spanner in the works.
Well, I think when you consider that the whole operation involves 6,000 to 7,000 ships and landing craft, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 troops, there's a lot of moving parts. And they're all interlocking. They've all got to happen in sequence. And the ability to bring that fleet across the channel in marginal weather conditions and then put it on the beach, quite a lot could have gone wrong. But in Omaha in particular, if they'd been stuck on the beaches for much longer than they had been, if they hadn't been able to penetrate up those passages off the beach, and the enfilade fire coming down from the Germans, at one stage, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, General Bradley actually considered bringing them off the beach and putting them onto Utah. And that would have been chaotic because round at Utah, of course, they're trying to do the same. Not so much opposition. You know, they only lost, I think, 197 people only. But the fact of life is, if you've added this going on to Omaha, onto Utah as well, then you can imagine the chaos and confusion that would have occurred. People redeploying, you'd have had blue on blue, you'd have had all sorts of issues. Quite apart from anything else, all the people who've briefed for this beach going on to one they haven't briefed for. And you know, Chris and I know from our own operational experience, if you try and do that, it'd be absolute chaos. So the whole western end would have been absolutely chaotic. And that would have given the Germans actually a chance to regroup from facing the airborne troops that they were mopping up at the time because they were quite scattered, come back and actually deal with what's going on. They also would have captured quite a few American troops as well. So they got intelligence from them, all sorts of things. That have also got the view that the American troops were well stocked with food, cigarettes and everything, which they weren't. So morale would have been affected thereby. But the fact of life is the operation was basically designed to be successful. That's not just optimism bias. Bradley again said, look, if we can achieve surprise, there's no way this isn't going to work. And that's the key to D-Day. The Germans were totally surprised in terms of time and position, and also the weight of the attack as well.
Well, that's a really interesting point. And whilst we're talking about the Allies, I'm just going to put some of these Allied divisions back on the board.
Okay,
Chris Copson, I mean, let's say, hypothetically, the Germans get a tip-off. There's an intelligence breach, and they know it's going to be 6th of June, there or thereabouts, and they know it's going to be Normandy. How much of an advantage does that give them?
It would have given them a fairly substantial advantage because not only would they have their positions in place, they'd have the 350-odd troops manning them. They'd bring up a mass of reserves. And, I mean, Dr. Chris has been saying, well, OK, you know, if you try and move a Panzer division, something like that, you're going to draw the attention of the cab rank of rocket-firing Typhoons. The only sort of, and I don't know whether you'd agree with this, the only sort of hair in that ointment to me is that
weather.
If the weather socks in, they can't fly. And also, particularly later on, it's the fact they've actually established airfields over in France, because the distance across the channel is going to limit your operational time in the target area. So there is the possibility that the Typhoons, the other aircraft, may not have been that effective.
I mean, the real issue for me, of course, is part of the softening up process that starts in April before June here, is we start destroying the railways. And the Germans famously move a lot of their armour by rail. And I think that would have been quite significant. We'd have interdicted the rail system, the road and the canal systems that lead to this. It sounds fatuous, but if the Germans had been tipped off, and we would have known that through our Enigma intercepts, we wouldn't have done it. That's the key point.
Simple as that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, if you're going to stop for the weather, you're certainly going to stop if you think you're not going to surprise the Germans.
Yeah.
You know, your whole massive investment in deception and op fortitude up by the Pas de Calais, you know, if that hasn't worked, and they still know, they also know a lot more. So why would you go there? I mean, there's no advantage whatsoever to what Churchill said at Anzio. He said, I thought we were throwing a wildcat onto the beach. It ended up being a stranded whale. And that's what you'd have ended up with here. Loads of people on the beach. You know, it'd be Dunkirk again. So you wouldn't do it. There's no way Eisenhower would have authorised it in those circumstances.
It's a colossal gamble. I mean, there's a lot of paranoia at the time. There's a schoolmaster who was compiling the Times crossword and was using code words associated with Operation Overlord. And that's got people running around in circles.
Including the beach names as well,
including
Chris.
the beach names.
Yeah.
That's, you know, if that's happening, that could completely mess everything up.
In fact, what I heard, Chris, is that he basically had been listening to some school children who'd been in the vicinity of some of the American and Canadian camps in southern England, and they'd overheard Juno Sword and these other overlords, and he thought, okay, I'm going to put those in the crossword. I mean, you know, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
You just can't cater for that, can you?
So are we saying that there was really nothing the Germans could have done on that day to defeat the Allied invasion?
Well, James, it wouldn't have happened. You wouldn't have had to defeat it. You'd have deterred it. And of course, that is the first principle of military action. You deter your enemy from doing something, then you don't have to engage.
No.
And frankly, trying to put that together again for another time would have been really difficult. There's no question about that.
This is the thing. This is June. You've got the short window of summer. I mean, the weather socks in immediately after we've got troops on the ground. The beaches are established.
Yeah, and one of the Mulberries is
the
destroyed.
American Mulberry at Vierville is destroyed. There's still bits of it on the sand there. If that had happened, there's then, you know, you're heading into September, into equinoctial storms, things like that. You're pushing into 1945.
If at all.
If at all.
Because I think if we hadn't done D-Day, we'd have, I think, looked at another option probably in the Mediterranean, Dragoon. I think what we have to remember in relation to D-Day is this is not a bunch of people who've never done it before. So the Americans have been looking at opposed landings on beaches since the 1920s. In fact, there was an Army field manual that came out in 1938, which really provided the doctrine for this. So did the United States Navy. We'd done North Africa, we'd done Sicily, we'd done Italy. In the Pacific, of course, the Americans were doing island hopping all the way across the Pacific. What's really interesting about D-Day, where's the US Marine Corps?
It's a good point.
It's not, they're not there. These are Army
in the Pacific.
Yeah, they're in the Pacific. They're leading the assault on the islands against the Japanese with the Army following in behind them. But one of the things that's always amazed me is there's no US Marine Corps element on the biggest amphibious operation in history.
Yeah. Well, this is fascinating, and I suppose now we should talk about what the long-term implications would have been had D-Day either been deterred or been defeated on the day. Chris Copson, what are we talking about? What's the legacy? Does the war get prolonged? What are the consequences?
I mean, starting with the basics, if it had failed, if we had not got ashore on Normandy in June 44, we would need to build things up to actually start again. That is going to take at least another year. Trying to get all of these assets in place. It's a gigantic process. I mean, it had been happening ever since the Americans came into the war.
And it has to work the second time.
And it has to work the second time.
There's no third time lucky, no.
There is no third time lucky. If it had failed, depending on how catastrophically, would there have been the possibility that we think we can't do this? I mean, it is the biggest amphibious operation, the most complex amphibious operation anyone has ever tried, and it hasn't worked. So, if we're not landing here, if we're not establishing the second front, what's going to happen then? Because, of course, there's an awful lot going on in Russia, in the USSR. If we don't actually get ashore here in France, if it takes us quite some time to actually think about something like an enlarged version of Operation Dragoon,
south of France. Yeah. Or we could have pushed up through Italy. I mean, Rome was taken about this time, of course, so we could have pushed up through Italy, and that was a possibility as well. I think there's an interesting political issue here. because most people in Britain would have said, aha, Churchill, Gallipoli, we remember the Gallipoli fiasco, here's another one. Would Churchill have survived, given
really
the opposition from his own party? In November, would Roosevelt have been re-elected in the United States? So there could have been real political repercussions here, which would have altered the balance of political view. Would the Americans have gone, you know what, we're going to say goodbye to Germany first as our primary strategy. We're going to concentrate on the Pacific now because we're good at that. And let's face it, the European theatre is a disaster. Now, Chris hinted earlier on what was going on in the East. The shortest distance, of course, to get to Berlin is actually from here. It's not from the East. No. Which is one of the reasons for opening this second front, is because the Germans were so nervous about how close the Ruhr industrial base was on the Rhine, and also the penetration into Germany. So what we're saying is we're not very far away from Germany here. So if we haven't landed, you can see the Russians pushing further west. And how many countries would they have actually gone into, other than the fact that we actually met them halfway? We let them get into Berlin before us, but actually, would Germany as a whole have been basically taken over by the Russians?
I mean, warfare on the Eastern Front is it's conducted on a scale, the ferocity that we find difficult to comprehend. But the Red Army would have come piling forward.
Just rolled forward. But here's the interesting thing. You've got the atomic bomb coming. The Manhattan Project is inbound. So would we have threatened Germany with an atomic weapon if they hadn't surrendered? Would we have said to the Russians, you don't come any further west, otherwise we're going to use one of our atomic weapons on you?
And do you think that one of the long-term consequences, had D-Day failed, that the Iron Curtain would be, I don't know, 100 miles further west?
Well, it could be the whole of Germany.
The whole of Germany, you think? And then the whole of the latter half of the 20th century plays out very differently.
Yeah, I mean, we were used to, going down to the inner-German border, looking over that big tall fence, there's minefields, and the villages have been screened off. I mean, that could have been the French border.
I mean, what's really interesting, if you look at the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939, one of the proposals from Russia to Germany was, we want Denmark, because we want to control the Baltic. And the Germans went, there's no way we're having that, because obviously we've got an interest in the Baltic. But that shows you where they were focused. But just think of about a Europe that has Denmark, Germany, Czechoslovakia, which eventually ended up in the pact, Austria, everything, say, except France, and the Iberian Peninsula, and Italy maybe, as part of the Warsaw Treaty Organization. I mean, and what interest would America have had in Europe as part of the Marshall Plan, all the reconstruction, NATO, all that sort of thing goes away.
And you think Nazi Germany still defeated eventually, but it just takes a bit longer because, of course, within, less than a year after D-Day, Nazi Germany surrendered. But you think maybe the war goes on until 46, 47?
It could have dragged on certainly into 46. I mean, we might be talking about 1939 to 47 when it comes down to it.
And also, I mean, the Russians needed this second front. I mean, Stalin was going on about it from 1942 onwards, and every year was saying, you're deliberately doing this, to make sure we get defeated. And to be fair, there is quite a neurosis amongst Western leaders from Yalta onwards about Russia's intentions if they get too far into Europe. Somebody rang me up yesterday, actually, and said to me that his father had actually trained not only in North Africa, but also in Arctic conditions, just in case we had to take on the Russians in 1945.
Well, listen, this has been absolutely fascinating. We could talk for hours, but I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. Thank you both so much. Big thanks to Chris Copson and Dr Chris Parry for joining me. We will be back undoing more battles from history, but in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel History Undone with James Hanson on YouTube. And if there's any battles you would like to see, let us know in the comments. You can also catch me presenting Frontline on Times Radio. That's it from us. Goodbye.